All right, welcome everybody. This is the SIG Instrumentation meeting. Today is January 9th, 2020. This is our first meeting of the decade. And we actually have a pretty full agenda. So without further ado, David, take it away.
Okie dokie. Let's see, is this the correct one? Okay, cool. So first of all, I just want to thank everyone who took a look at the tracing proposal, and I'm glad we were able to merge it as provisional. I really appreciate that. But the main thing that I wanted to talk about is a follow-up from KubeCon, which is we sort of have a couple different proposals. We've got the tracing, the structured logging, and the request ID proposal. And we wanted to explore the idea of having them share mechanisms for how they attach labels or metadata in general to the telemetry, right? So we want to see if we can make sure that traces and logs have consistent ways of matching them to containers or pods or whatnot. So I investigated this about a month ago, but basically there's a thing in OpenTelemetry called distributed context, which is basically, you can think of it as being similar to span context, except for a different purpose. So it's just a map that contains string key values. And just like span context, it's passed around in a context.context, and it can be propagated across component boundaries. So just like we're doing for tracing, we could send around these key value pairs stored in HTTP headers when we're passing it that way, or in the context.context in process. And this is how OpenTelemetry does trace to metric correlation, is that you can set a tag in one process, propagate everything to the second process via a call, and then that second process can produce metrics or traces with the same set of metadata. So one thing we could potentially do is use this both for structured logging and for tracing. And this is what that would look like. So at some point in the process, someone has to attach a tag, such as the pod name. And then the API servers, telemetry would all have that. But then also controllers that receive this down the line are able to, without embedding any knowledge of how to, say, attach metadata for a pod, they can just take they're able, just by using the context.context that we have from our trace and passing that to whatever logging function we use, we can then retrieve that metadata in the implementation of logging and attach that as a structured log. So this is a way sort of to get everything in one and to have them all share the same sort of place in the context.context for keeping our key value map for labels, right? And it's also somewhat nice that it works across other boundaries as well. So even things like the container runtime or etcd could, their logs and traces can have, let me check this. Yes, I think the recording is on, right?
It is,
Sorry,
yes.
someone asked in chat. But even like etcd or the container runtime can have telemetry that contains information, say, about the object or about the pod in the container runtime's case. The second option is we could just have each of them do their own thing. Tracing uses its thing, and logging uses its own key in the context.context. And that's sort of how I think the proposals are currently written, if I recall correctly, which is that the logging proposal says we're going to stick our keys and values here in the context.context, and tracing obviously says, let's use OpenTelemetry, which uses this distributed context thing. So we could also do this. And just to bring the request ID proposal into this quickly, as we've discussed in the past, the request ID proposal is sort of a simplified version of both tracing and logging, where they want what is essentially amounts to a trace ID in the log. And as we've discussed, we are pretty sure that we can meet the requirements of the request ID proposal using both the tracing and logging proposals. But to be specific, if we went with the distributed context route, the trace ID would be one of the pieces that is in the distributed context that the logging implementation could use. And so we would get that for free if we went that route. And I think that's all I've got. So happy to answer
what
questions.
sort of timeline are we looking for getting these things in?
So that's a good question. I don't have a particular timeline. I know the structured logging folks maybe have tighter goals in terms of their timeline, but I'm happy to wait as long as it takes for us to resolve our discussions and stuff on this.
But,
I know that.
So the trace ID is dependent on, I mean, like to use, for the request ID stuff, you would need the tracing stuff implemented, right?
Yes. Yep. I actually did take a look at the request ID proposal this morning because it looks like they pushed some updates. And it actually proposes using the same, I want to say, mechanism as tracing proposes. In other words, they want to, when a request comes in, add an annotation and then grab the annotation out whenever you act on an object to attach the request ID.
They're doing like a lightweight tracing thing.
Yeah, you could call it that. Yeah, tracing without the notion of spans, essentially just trace ID propagation. So yeah, everything sort of fits together. But happy to answer questions, or I know we have a full agenda, so we can move on as well.
One point of one thing that I wanted to make sure is clarified for me in my head. You said that the distributed context is embedded into context.
Yes, so it's a weird thing to think about because context.context in Go is itself a key value map, right? So distributed context is one of the values that is itself a string-to-string map. It is the keys in context are not generally usable simply because they're usually like you're supposed to make a private struct and then use that as the key so no one else can steal it. So we don't really just want to use the map that's in context.context right away. So that's why we want a map of, something which is context.context to a map of string that we can then use for labels.
Yeah, that makes sense. I just wanted to make sure that's how I understood it, but I just wanted to double check. So if that's the case, I don't really see the dependency of the structured logging and tracing. I feel like it's like an implementation detail of where the things are stored, but like the way I see it, the caps could be implemented independently and then unified at a later point. No?
Yes, that's true.
Yeah, this is exactly what I wanted to say. That that within the this logging cap, we only define that we want to have some kind of Kubernetes specific package, which provides an API which can be used to attach some information with the context. So we don't define how it's implemented, and we can use OpenTelemetry distributed context as a as a implementation detail.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Yeah, that's exactly what the impression that I had as well. Because with this package, we're essentially encapsulating this, and whether we use distributed context inside is really an implementation detail. So yeah, I think we're all saying the same thing and are agreeing. So.
Yep.
One thing that we did merge the tracing enhancement proposal.
Are you frozen? No.
Oh, we lost.
I'm guessing he will have to leave and come back.
Which will
Hit him up on Slack one.
Right, I'll put him on Slack. Okay, but I think I'm done presenting. It sounds like we might chat about the tracing proposal for a minute or so. Oops. There we go.
I'm so sorry, everyone. Can you hear us again?
Yeah, you're back.
Sorry. New office, new unstable internet connection. Sorry. What I was saying was that in the same way I asked structured logging to double check with SIG architecture about the CAP, could we double check the same thing for the tracing CAP? I think that's probably one of the biggest things for both CAPs to go into implementable, I believe. Just a sign off from SIG architecture, essentially. I think they're different for structured logging and tracing, because tracing essentially is about the introduction of potentially new components or a large dependency, whereas structured logging is more like a general overview of them. Does that make sense?
Yep. I also still need to run this by SIG CLI and SIG
API machinery.
So there's still a little bit more SIG shopping to be done for tracing.
Yeah, and SIG structured logging, today I discussed it with DIMS, and overall, like, there is okay, but we'll be sending it to more people, and I send it today to SIG architecture mailing list, and possibly will be if there will be more questions, we'll be discussing it on next meeting, so on 16th January.
Okay. I had a very short internet blip again, but David, you mentioned that you're talking to API machinery about plumbing context as well, or?
No, I need to. So API machinery owns the API server and to make changes to as part of this. So I need to go talk to them and say, hey, how's this sound? And get their sign on.
Got it. Do people feel that as part of both of these CAPs, or either of those CAPs, we need to talk to API machinery about potentially plumbing context through client Go?
Client Go, yeah. Client Go is that would have to be brought up in the API machinery meeting.
Yeah. So I was already talking to Marek about this the other day, and I saw that a couple of client Go clients already implement. A very few select ones implement plumbing context. So I assume API machinery isn't entirely against it, but it's a conversation.
I think it should be fine.
Okay.
I think it should be fine, but we need to float it and then probably make all the tracking tickets and make sure that the entire API service area is like covered.
So David,
and then swap over all the references that are used by Client Go internally.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. David or Marek, who do you think either of you could take care of that, or maybe Han?
I mean, I'll gladly go stop by SIG API machinery. It'd be nice to have Han along with me, but
yeah. Well, I mean, I'll be there. So
it seems like you need to talk to SIG API machinery anyway, so I think that makes perfect sense. Okay. I mean, it's kind of, we've already been discussing this topic, but the second topic that we have today is update request ID cap and add basic interaction idea. Is the author of this here?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm here, and
Yes.
I explain.
Go ahead.
Okay. I share the screen.
Mm-hmm.
Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay. I updated request ID caps and basic policy of request ID minimize the impact to existing features and simple implementation. And I would like to collaborate and interact with related caps. This means as follows. I would like to ensure consistent metadata, and this may need to be considered and managed across the Kubernetes beyond the related caps. And implementation which does not interfere related caps implementation. And here is design overview. Request ID feature consists of the following two features. And first, export request ID to each Kubernetes component log. And second, propagate request ID to related objects. This is design overview of export request ID. And I consider collaboration with related cape. As you know, there is the existing cape's structured logging feature that related log exporting. And main concept of this feature is structured the log format and replace existing klog with log R for structuring. And structured format is attractive for me, but this replacement is very tough work and maybe required troublesome migration steps. In this situation, it is expected to take a long time to migration completely. So in the meantime, request ID feature, I would like to take more simple way to export ID information to log files. But it is possibility that request ID feature may take a structured logging feature in the future. And also there is another related cape, tracing capes that propagate trace ID to related Kubernetes objects. This feature adds this information to annotations of objects. And annotations is existing feature of Kubernetes, and request ID feature adapts same method. This is idea of design of export request ID. As a result, exporting request ID is, I think this is implementable by just reading annotations from objects when using klog. And note that this is no impact to existing klog feature. This is example of source code and log output. This is original source code of Kubernetes scheduler.go. And this is klog. And here is add request ID exportation into klog. I would like to add following description. And this is original log output, and here is request ID log output. And process of this method, I think no impact to existing klog feature, and as a result, no interfere with the structured logging implementation during migration to log R. But I think there is restricts. I think only objects that can be obtained within the function scope calling klog can read annotations.
One second. So the thing is, I agree that there is no impact to the existing keylog feature, but the thing is, we're actually changing the output of the log messages, and I know that for structured logging, there has been a concern about breaking implicit APIs of existing log messages.
Yeah. So yeah, one of our goals was to not like on most in some like most strange cases, people even hardcode regex rules based on the logs. I've seen kubeadmin doing it. So one of our goals was to avoid having any impact on default configuration.
So by appending a request ID to a bunch of logs, we're effectively changing some, I mean, it's not really a valid API, but it is an API which people are currently kind of depending on. So there's a potential of breaking ingestion downstream for people.
My understanding is that this essentially is intending for this to be done on a more or less line-by-line basis. In which case, I'm not too concerned about the breaking of log lines, but what I am a bit concerned about is that it does somewhat interfere with structured logging because it makes the migration harder.
Because you're changing a bunch of log lines.
As we are changing a bunch of log lines, or actually we're kind of encouraging for log lines to be changed, which is sorry, something that I, at this point, would try to avoid encouraging, judging by us wanting to introduce the structured logging. I don't know how others feel about that.
Wouldn't because this feature would require propagation of context, so wouldn't be like further in timeline after like even structured logging starts?
Yeah, I tend to agree. Like context plumbing isn't there everywhere anyways. It needs to be done, and then we need to figure out the way to add and read from the context. So I feel like we would actually end up with a relatively similar timeline to structured logging, except for the migration part. But I feel like I'm not sure I'm seeing enough of a benefit in the comparison that I think doing this right now is like worth making the migration.
It overlaps too much, right?
Sorry?
It overlaps too much with existing things.
I feel like that as well.
Excuse me, sorry, I can't understand all of your comments due to lack of my English listening skills. So I will be very appreciated if you write your comments on my tips on GitHub.
Yeah, I think we can absolutely do that
after this meeting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks. Sorry, I don't understand all of your feedbacks.
No problem. We'll make sure to comment on the enhancement, and there will also be a recording of this meeting if you think that's helpful.
Thank you. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, in that case, let's go to our last topic, which I'm not sure I have an entire solution, but let me.
Okay, I can give some context on that.
Yeah,
so the problem is that we, for monitoring, we maintain metric server, which exposes a metrics API that provides one memory value. Historically, this memory value was this type of memory, because it exposes 4 types of memory. So metric server, like at some point, there was a decision to expose. I think it was working set, but the decision itself was not what's anywhere aside of API, which with metric server history, it led to changes at the beginning, we are not aware that the changes were made, and later we were trying to figure out what was the correct value. But I think at the end, I somewhat discussed or through emails with David Ashpol. So I think at the end, David has the best knowledge what we should expose. And I think the original idea of working set was correct, and we can. What we are basically missing is a correct documentation why this decision was made. And I think, David, can you talk about why we are using working set, or why we were using working set?
So there's a couple questions. One is, given that the kubelet uses working set for eviction, what should we do for the metric server, which is probably do the same thing. But the decision to use working set in the kubelet, I can talk about a little bit too. And this is, let's see, this dates back to very, very, very early Kubernetes, and it actually is stolen from Borg. So we use a similar metric to what Borg has used for a long time. So some of this is just practical experience, and some of this is also, it makes sense in theory at least. So the working set is the total memory usage, and from that we subtract the pages on the inactive file list. And to summarize it, you can basically think of the kernel as keeping sets of pages it thinks are being used that are backed by files, and pages that it thinks are not being used. And it sort of keeps balancing these lists to try and keep the hotter ones in one side and the colder ones on another. So all of this is to say it's not exact. There are cases where it doesn't work very well, which have, there are many issues on GitHub about that. But generally, as a heuristic, it's been fairly good. Meaning to say, especially as you start to run out of memory, the working set tends to approach the actual memory usage that the kernel is unable to reclaim were it to run out. And so because of that, that's why we use it for kubelet evictions, because at the time we need it to be correct, it's about correct. It is maybe worth considering whether this is the correct metric to use for the metric server, as it will tend to overestimate memory usage when there is a lot of reclaimable memory. But if you make some assumptions, such as we care most about the metric when we're getting close to our limit, then it's a quite reasonable metric to use.
Yeah,
so
I think.
Does that?
I think we have 1 minute left, but the reason why this was brought up is because metric server actually uses RSS, I believe, because the VPA folks requested this or something like that, because it didn't quite work with working set bytes or something like that.
So this is based on their incorrect assumption. That's what David discussed, was there was some incorrect assumptions when the value was switched. So what VPA people, their goal is to estimate memory, to give a pod minimal memory that it doesn't get out of a memory or evicted, which means this is how David explained it. This is our best estimation. So I think what we are mainly missing is a correct documentation because of our design, and this should also simplify, because there are lots of people that asking why metric server gives us this memory and Prometheus gives other value. And this would give us full explanation why we need this type in this place.
Okay. So essentially, we are wrong in metric server right now. We should switch back to using actual working set bytes.
Yes, starting from 0.3 metric server uses incorrect value of memory. We should. I will create the issues to fix it and maybe ask David to write something nice, or I will try to write something.
I was going to ask the exact same thing. Yes. Okay. We actually already 1 minute over. I apologize for anyone who has to go somewhere else. But we are also out of agenda items, so it was a very productive meeting. Thanks, everyone. I hope everyone had a wonderful start into the new year and have a wonderful local time. Bye.
Ciao. Bye, everyone.
Bye.